Hi, welcome to chapter 35, America in World War II. I'm actually going to begin on page 821 of the textbook, and actually this goes a long way to explaining primarily learning objective number one. So you might want to look into that. You have to see a couple of things before this whole attack on Pearl Harbor and how this came to be. Again, we were trying to stay away from the actual troubles in Europe. People had a sense that the war was coming, but they chose to ignore it. Again, like I said in class, there were too many things going on in the United States at the time that were attention getters. Like, for example, as ridiculous as it may sound, Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak was front news, front page news, and people were more interested in that than what was going on in the war. In a lot of ways, it was helpful for people to actually not be paying attention to the things that were going on in the world. However, as the book explains here, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a total surprise, was a complete disaster for the United States. A great part of its fleet actually was decimated in Pearl Harbor. But it says here that Japan's fanatics forgot that whoever stabs a king must stab to kill rather. And again, this is sort of making an allusion to a Shakespearean play that if you're actually going to do us harm, you better do us harm to the point where we cannot act back. And what Japan did, even though it was very significant, it was only sort of like a surface damage in the overall sense. That is to say, you're attacking a country like America. The United States is full of natural resources. Could we rebuild the Navy that we lost in Pearl Harbor? Absolutely. Are we going to do it? Very rapidly. Again, decisions are going to be made because the public opinion at the time, after December 7th, when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, the actual reaction of the people was to get Japan to incite some kind of revenge, to avenge the bloody treachery, it says, to get Japan first. Unfortunately, Washington had other plans. And those plans included something called the ABC-1 agreement with the British. Roosevelt and Churchill got together and agreed that it was more important for the Allies, meaning the United States and Britain, to get Germany first. Two reasons for that. I mean, Germany had the offensive in the Eastern Front against Russia, or the Soviet Union rather, and also was across the English Channel from England. And here's England, the last bastion of democracy in Europe, about to fall to the hands of Hitler. We can't let that happen. So we're going to switch, we're going to trade space for time. We're basically going to try to jump ahead, try to get the business finished in Europe, which we are not even close to starting, and then get Japan. It says here on page 821, second column here, it says the Get Germany First strategy was a solid foundation on which all American military strategy was built, but it encountered much ignorant criticism from two-fisted Americans who again thirst for revenge against Japan. You have to put your ducks in a line here, and you have to understand that to lose England in Europe would have been a bigger disaster than losing a few more islands in the South Pacific. So that's the trade that we make, trading space for time. It also begins on page 821. This idea that time, in a sense, it says on page 822, was of the essence, was the most important munition. Expense was no limitation. Again, we're a country full of resources. We have the labor to get things done. And America, the only thing that it needed really was to retool itself, like we talked about in World War I, for the actual all-out war production, while praying that the dictators would not meanwhile crush their adversary who still remained in the field, notably Britain and the Soviet Union. is there some logic on this? There is absolutely logic behind this. And again, we have been helping Britain for a while in the great battle for Britain in the air, when the Royal Air Force battled the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, for the skies over England. In a large part, many of the pilots, not all of the pilots, but many of the pilots that actually were flying British planes at this point were a group of American volunteers. Again, so Americans were already fighting before we decided to declare war on this. There's a couple of things about. There was a question actually that somebody asked about this, whether people were aware of what was going on in the world, or I can't remember what the question is, but the fact that people didn't know what was going on in the world. There's some debate to that. I talked to Mr. Moore, who was subbing for me today, and we did actually come to a conclusion in terms of that. Again, I have to say that it was more an ignorance of convenience, that people really didn't want to see what was going on in the world now that we are involved in the war, by declaring war on the Japanese. Congress declared war on the Japanese. Hitler declared war on us. And again, this is something that happened as one thing led to another, happened as what was going to be taking place, regardless of what the chain of events were. So again, this is something that, once you take a step towards war, the next step just happens. The next is just continuous, and it doesn't stop until somebody wins. And that's the history of the conflict itself. So you have to look at it in that perspective, whether people were ignorant of it or whether people were just really not into, the real causes of the war. Again, you need to remember two things. Their first reaction was revenge on Japan. Their second reaction was getting Germany first. That made no sense to them until they realized that we need to help Britain. If we lose Britain, we're going to have a hell of a problem in our hands, because it's going to be more difficult to actually get Hitler out of Europe. So again, talking about objective number 2, describing the domestic mobilization for the war. Again, I don't really have to add too much to this other than to say that if it's very comparable to what happened in World War I. Factories begin to switch the mode from consumer goods to war goods. Again, there's this question of the immigration issue. We're starting to see that the German Americans that are here are now a generation further into selling themselves here. So we're not really going to have that much problem with the loyalty of German Americans and Italian Americans. However, the exception, the painful exception here on page 822 is the idea that Japanese Americans are being sent to internment camps. Even American-born Japanese were sent to internment camps. And again, this is going to be really a black eye in our history, what we did to them. But again, we talk about this on page 823. You can read about this idea of what happened to the Japanese. Also, the part of the mobilization towards war. On page 823, this idea of ending the New Deal and starting Dr. Win the War. So Mr. New Deal or Dr. New Deal was dead or sent into retirement, and now on page 823 again, this part where example that in Roosevelt declared in 1943 that the New Deal was over. What we need to do now is win the war. So again, that's the type of mobilization that occurred. There's a couple of other things here that talks about the Atlantic Charter. On page 823, you might want to look into that a little bit also. And I'm going to come back on page 826 and talk about how we built the war machine, and again how the industry got in place to actually accomplish this and prepare for the war.